So what exactly is OpenCV? OpenCV stands for Open Source Computer Vision and was an Intel initiative launched in 1999. Now the primary purpose of OpenCV was to consolidate a lot of the computer vision research that was being done back then. And a lot of this research was written in C++, which is why OpenCV is actually written in C++. However, there are several bindings that exist that allow us to use OpenCV in Python, Java, MATLAB, and mobile phone applications as well. These bindings are quite useful, however, they do tend to slow down OpenCV's operation. So if you want speed, use OpenCV in C++. However, using it in Python allows us to easily grasp complex concepts and use NumPy, which is a powerful data array tool in Python. So the first major release of OpenCV was actually in 2006, and the second in 2009, and third just last year in 2015. Now, in this course, I will actually encourage you to use 2.413. It's actually very new. The latest release, I think, was just last year. However, you can check the website. It may be in later version by the time you read this course. And it's quite stable and it's widely deployed. I remember seeing stats saying that people still, up to 60% of researchers still use OpenCV 2.413. Now, if you think there's a need for you to use OpenCV 3.x, you can go ahead and install. However, there actually are some disadvantages to using 3.0 plus. Now, some important algorithms such as SIFT and SIF have actually been removed. You can actually manually add them back in. However, it's a bit tedious, and I'm not going to actually encourage you to do that during this course. I'll put links up, and you're free to do so as you please. If you want to learn more about OpenCV, you can go to opencv.org or check the Wikipedia page. I should also say that OpenCV 3.x actually has a lot of the modern research built into it as well. However, and bug fixes. However, if you don't think you're going to use those, maybe just stick with 2.413. So I think you're about ready to get started with programming with OpenCV and Python. So let's begin. Hi, and welcome to your first code along session in this course. So we're finally here using OpenCV. So this code in this IPython notebook is actually going to teach you to read, write, and display images with OpenCV. Now this code is heavily commented, at least by my standards, and it is going to teach you how to do the functions I described above. So to run each block of code, you press Control Enter, or on MacBooks, I believe it's Command Enter, and we run it, and there we go. So you should see, maybe in a second or two, a 1 comes up here, and that means that the code was run successfully. So to import OpenCV into Python, if you're familiar with Python, you would know you'd have to import a lot of different modules and libraries into Python, so we can utilize advanced functions. OpenCV is called CV2, maybe because the first version was called CV1, so we import it as CV2. Secondly, we don't necessarily need to import NumPy into this first code session here, but it's also always a good habit because you never know when you actually need to use NumPy to edit image arrays. We import NumPy as NP, mainly because it's neater to write code using an NP instead of NumPy. We could have pretty much called this anything, could have called it X, however the convention in Python is to use NP for NumPy. So let's run this block of code as well. There we go. So now let's load our first image. Now if you have a one notebook open, you don't necessarily need to import CV2 again. However, it's a good habit. It avoids missing libraries and allows you to run blocks of code independently. So do it to get into the habit. So now we use the cv2.imread function to load images. Now I would have given you a folder of images that we use in this course. So the argument we enter into the imread function is the path to the image directory, the image file actually, and that returns the image here. So we're storing the first image here as input. And now to display this image, we actually call on the cv2.imShow function. Now this function takes two arguments. I've put all the notes in the comments here in case you want to go over this on your own. However, I will talk it out to you. So the first argument is the title that's going to be displayed on the window. So since this is your first computer vision app you're going to make in Python, let's call this the Hello World version. And the image file that we want to open is going to be the input file that we previously loaded into here. Now you would see this wait key and destroy all Windows keys. Those are not necessarily that important, however you should always use them when you're loading images. The wait key waits for you to press any key and then it closes the window. The destroy all windows function actually is very important, otherwise it leaves your window hanging. Without this function you would basically need to crash your Python and then restart it through kernel restart here. So let's not do that. So let's run this first code here. There we are. Here's our input image. It's a picture of the Louvre that I took in Paris when I was there a couple of years ago. And there we go. So you've loaded your first image into OpenCV. Now this is a code without all the comments. It's much neater, and throughout the course I probably will run the code that looks like this. Sometimes I will comment like load image here. However, it's not too difficult to understand. I hope you guys are following this well. If there's ever anything that's unclear in my course, please hit me a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, perhaps within 24 hours. So now let's take a closer look at how images are stored. So now let's import numpy as np, and using numpy's .shape function. .shape is actually very useful when you're looking at the dimensions of an array. You enter the array .shape and it returns a tuple which gives you the dimensions of an image. So the 830 1245 represent the 2D xy dimensions of the image, 830 being the height, 1245 being the width, and 3 being the RGB values of the image. So let's take a look at looking at the height and width of the image by actually displaying it using the print function. What we're showing here is that we can isolate the height and width of this array, which you see will be useful later on. We use int just to convert it into a simple value, because otherwise it comes up with an L here, and we put pixels here. This is just simple string concatenation, very basic Python. I hope it's not too difficult for you if you're unfamiliar, and that's it there. So now let's go on to saving images in OpenCV. We use the cv2imwrite function, which is very similar to the, as you can see, the imread function. However, this one has two arguments. First argument is the name of the file that we're going to save it as. Now, anytime you're opening files or writing files in OpenCV functions, use these inverted commas to indicate that it's a string. Secondly, this second argument here is going to be the file name of the image. So as we previously loaded our image as input using an imread function, we can then put input here, and that writes the file. Now, one cool thing about OpenCV is that it actually stores in multiple formats. You can actually read in multiple formats too. JPEGs, PNGs are the most common types, but I believe you can do BMPs and a few other image types as well. So we run this, and this should be written to your working directory in Python. You can just take a look in your file explorer and you'll see it there. If it didn't successfully run for some reason, it would return a false in the output statements here. Okay, so that's it for your first basic lesson in OpenCV. I hope you guys had fun. We're going to move on now into grayscaling images.